Some people walk into a room and you can feel it. The air changes. The temperature drops. Everyone straightens up without knowing why. That's what happened the day Chase Whitfield walked into St. Marian Medical Center. He was 26 years old, 6'2", built like a heavyweight fighter because that's exactly what he was. 3 years of amateur MMA, a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and a father worth more money than the hospital's entire East Wing. He didn't walk into that hospital to fight anyone. He walked in because his father, Arthur Whitfield, had just been rushed into the ICU after a heart attack on the 17th hole of his private golf course. But before the sun went down that day, Chase Whitfield would challenge a hospital nurse to a fight in front of 30 witnesses. And he had no idea, none at all, that the quiet, soft-spoken woman in blue scrubs standing across from him had once led men through the worst nights of their lives. Places where a wrong decision didn't mean losing an argument. It meant somebody didn't come home. Her name on her badge said S. Reyes, RN. But 3 years earlier, in a place far from any hospital, men twice her size called her by a different name. They called her Ghost. This is the story of the day those two worlds collided. How the quietest person in that hallway turned out to be the most dangerous one in it. And how a family already broken by fear came within one bad decision of losing something they could never get back. Stay with me. Because this story isn't really about a fight. It's about what happens when arrogance meets someone who has nothing left to prove and everything to protect. And it's about how the past never really stays in the past. It just waits, quietly.
Sarah Reyes had been
for
a
the
nurse
moment
at
St.
St.
Marian
Mary's.
for exactly 11 days. 11 days of double shifts, 11 days of learning where the supply closets were, memorizing the names of 40 different doctors, and getting used to a hospital cafeteria that ran out of coffee by 10 in the morning. 11 days of small, ordinary humiliations that come with being the newest person in any workplace. Being handed the charts nobody wanted, being talked over in meetings, being the last one told when schedules changed. Nobody at St. Marian knew her story, and that was exactly how she wanted it. She'd rented a small one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from the hospital, furnished with exactly enough to get by. A mattress, a folding table, 2 chairs, and a single framed photograph she kept in a drawer instead of on display. She told herself that was practical. Movers were expensive, and she didn't know yet if this city, this hospital, this new version of her life would stick. The truth was more complicated than practicality. 3 years before she ever set foot in that hospital, Sarah had worn a different uniform. She'd spent 6 years in the Navy, the last 2 of them attached to a specialized medical support element that operated alongside special operations teams. The kind of unit that doesn't show up in recruiting commercials, the kind where your entire job description could be summed up in one sentence. Keep them alive in the 90 seconds after everything goes wrong. She wasn't a SEAL herself. The Navy didn't work that way, and she was careful, always, never to claim a title that wasn't hers. But she had trained alongside them, deployed alongside them, carried the same weight on her back through the same mountains and the same dark rooms. And more than once, she had been the only reason a wounded operator made it out of a building standing up instead of on a stretcher. Over time, the men she served with stopped seeing her as the medic, a word that in some units carried a quiet distance, a sense of support staff rather than one of us. They started calling her one of their own instead, and they gave her the name that stuck to her long after she left that life behind, Ghost. Because she had a habit of staying calm and invisible in chaos, moving through danger like it didn't touch her. Steady hands even when the ground was shaking, a low, even voice on the radio even when everything around her was screaming. When her contract ended, Sarah didn't talk about any of it. She didn't post about it online. She didn't put it on her resume beyond a single flat line. Former Navy medical corpsman, honorably discharged. She went back to school on the GI Bill, got her RN license 2 years later, and started over as a civilian nurse. Because deep down, healing people in a place where nobody was shooting at anyone was the only part of that old life she wanted to carry forward. St. Marian Medical Center was supposed to be her fresh start, a quiet ICU rotation, regular hours, No explosions, no radios crackling with emergency call signs, no adrenaline that made your hands shake for hours afterward, alone in a barracks room, staring at the ceiling. Or so she thought. Her direct supervisor, a nurse named Denise Caro, had taken an instant dislike to her. Sarah wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was because Sarah didn't gossip in the break room, or maybe it was simply that Denise, who had run this floor for 9 years without much challenge, didn't like being questioned by anyone, especially not the new hire. Whatever the reason, Denise made it her quiet mission to remind Sarah daily that she was the least senior person on the floor. "New girl handles the overflow," Denise would say, sliding a clipboard across the counter without looking up. "That's how it works here." Sarah never argued. She just nodded, took the clipboard, and did the work, including, on the 11th day, being assigned to a private VIP suite on the 4th floor. The patient in that suite was Arthur Whitfield, 61 years old, real estate mogul, major hospital donor, the kind of man whose name was etched into a bronze plaque in the main lobby, right next to the words, "Whitfield Cardiac Wing." The very wing that would now, with a strange and bitter irony, be treating him. And waiting outside his room, pacing like a caged animal in that hallway later that evening, you have to go back 3 years, to a place Sarah Reyes almost never let herself think about anymore. It was a compound on the outskirts of a city, whose name never made the news, during an operation that officially still doesn't exist in any public record. Sarah was 26 then, too. The same age Chase Whitfield was now, though the two of them could not have been more different in what that age had asked of them. The operation had gone sideways almost from the moment the team breached the first door. What should have been a clean 15-minute extraction turned into a 3-hour firefight, with the team pinned in a courtyard while reinforcements the intelligence hadn't accounted for closed in from 2 directions. Halfway through, a team member, call sign Diesel, a broad-shouldered gunner who'd spent the last 6 months teaching Sarah how to throw a proper right hook during downtime, half as a joke, half because he insisted every medic on his team needed to know how to defend herself, took a round through the upper thigh, close enough to the femoral artery that the team lead's voice, usually flat and controlled even under fire, cracked with something close to panic over the radio. "Ghost, I need you up here now." Sarah moved across open ground under fire to reach him. She still couldn't fully explain, even to herself years later, how she made that decision so fast. There wasn't really a decision at all, just her body already moving before her mind finished processing the danger. She got to Diesel, packed the wound, applied a tourniquet with hands that did not shake, even though her heart was slamming against her ribs hard enough to bruise, and kept him talking. Kept him present, kept him fighting to stay conscious. For the 11 minutes it took to get him to a position where they could load him onto the extraction bird, he lived. He walked at his own wedding 18 months later, on a leg that worked because a 26-year-old medic refused to let go of pressure on an artery while bullets cracked past, close enough to hear the air split. That was the night the name Ghost stopped being a joke and became something the whole team said with genuine respect, not because she'd done anything flashy, because in the worst 90 seconds of another man's life, she hadn't hesitated, hadn't panicked, hadn't needed anyone to tell her what to do. But that operation cost the team something else, too. A second casualty that night. Call sign Bishop, one of the quietest, gentlest men Sarah had ever served alongside, a guy who kept a photo of his daughter's first birthday folded into his vest, didn't make it. Sarah had been with him in the final minutes. She never talked about what he said to her in those minutes, not to anyone, not even to the therapist the Navy required her to see afterward. Some things, she decided, belonged only to the person who was there. The tattoo on her forearm, the anchor wrapped in a trident with 3 sets of initials beneath it, wasn't a trophy. It was a promise. Diesel's initials were there because he'd lived, and she wanted to remember what it felt like to win. Bishop's were there because she never wanted to forget what it cost when she didn't. And the 3rd set belonged to a corpsman she'd trained under, a mentor who died in a training accident 2 years before that night, whose calm voice she still heard sometimes, unbidden, in the middle of a difficult shift. Slow as smooth, Smooth is fast. Don't let the noise make ended. Back on base, Sarah remembered sitting alone in a laundry room at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, running the same 11 minutes over and over in her mind, searching for the moment she could have moved faster, done better, somehow saved both men instead of just one. A team psychologist eventually helped her understand that the math of combat medicine doesn't work in absolutes. You don't get to save everyone, and the guilt of the one you lost will always sit right beside the relief of the one you saved, for as long as you carry the memory at all. Learning to hold both of those feelings at once without letting either one break her turned out to be its own kind of training, harder in some ways than anything she'd learned in the field. She carried those words and that lesson with her every single day at St. Marian, whether anyone knew it or not. They were the reason she never raised her voice at difficult patients. They were the reason she didn't panic during codes when younger nurses froze. And they would be the exact reason that 3 floors up, in a hallway full of strangers, she would stand perfectly still in front of an angry young man twice her size and feel absolutely nothing that resembled fear. Because compared to what she'd already survived, Chase Whitfield wasn't a threat. He was just scared. And scared, to Sarah Reyes, was a language she understood better. Standing outside his father's room for nearly 2 hours by the time Sarah's shift started. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He'd driven straight from the golf course in the ambulance's wake, still wearing the polo shirt and khakis he'd had on when the club's medical staff found his father collapsed on the 17th green, one hand pressed uselessly against his own chest as if he could somehow push the pain back inside. Fear, in people like Chase, doesn't usually look like tears. It looks like anger. It looks like control. And Chase Whitfield had spent his entire adult life being told, implicitly and explicitly, that control was something you took, not something you asked for. His father had built an empire on exactly that principle. Chase had grown up watching rooms rearrange themselves around Arthur Whitfield's presence, watching problems dissolve the moment his father decided they would. Now his father was the one who looked small, tubes and wires instead of a tailored suit, a heart monitor instead of a boardroom full of people hanging on his every word. And there was nothing Chase could do about it. No amount of money or intimidation that could fix the thing actually broken in that room. So when Sarah walked in to check his father's vitals, Chase was standing at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, glaring at the heart monitor, like he could will the numbers to change through sheer force of will. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, a demand. "Sarah Reyes, I'm one of the nurses on this floor tonight," she said, calm and even, already moving toward the monitor to check the readings. "I'm just going to check your father's vitals. Where's the doctor? I want the actual doctor, not a nurse." "Dr. Alvarez already came through an hour ago. I have his notes right here." Sarah kept her voice level, the way she'd been trained to, years ago, in rooms far more chaotic than this one. "Your father's stable right now. His numbers are actually looking better than they were this morning. The clot they cleared during the catheterization procedure was caught early. That matters a lot." Chase didn't seem to hear a word of it. "I don't care what the notes say. I want someone senior in here, not some—" He gestured at her vaguely, like he couldn't be bothered to finish the sentence. "Some new hire checking boxes." It wasn't the first time Sarah had been underestimated. It wouldn't be the last. She simply nodded, finished her check, recorded the numbers on the chart, and turned to leave the room without a word of protest. But Chase followed her out into the hallway. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Sarah stopped and turned. Down the hall, a few other nurses had paused what they were doing, sensing the shift in the air the way hospital staff always do when a family member is about to escalate. "Mr. Whitfield, I understand you're worried about your father. That's completely normal." She kept her tone even, professional, the tone she used with every scared family member, rich or not. "But I promise you, everyone on this floor is doing everything possible for him. Don't tell me what's normal." His voice had risen now, sharp enough that 2 orderlies near the nurses' station turned to look. "You people don't understand what my family has done for this hospital. My father's name is on a wing of this building. I could buy this entire floor and not even feel it, and I'm supposed to trust his care to whoever happens to be standing around at 8 p.m. Sarah's expression didn't change. That, more than anything, seemed to make Chase angrier. "You're not even listening to me," he snapped, taking a step closer, close enough now that a passing visitor pulled her child gently away from the hallway. "I am listening," Sarah said quietly. "I just don't think yelling in a hallway is going to help your father get better faster. If you want, I can page Dr. Alvarez to come speak with you directly so you can hear the plan straight from him." For a moment, something flickered across Chase's face. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe the first flicker of recognition that he was making a scene in front of a dozen strangers. But before he could back down on his own, Denise Caro rounded the corner, saw the commotion, and did exactly the wrong thing. "I'm so sorry about this," Denise said, practically running to insert herself between Chase and Sarah, her voice pitched an octave higher than usual, sugar sweet in the specific way people get when they're afraid of losing something important. "Is there a problem? Your new hire doesn't seem to understand who my father is," Chase said, his voice thick with frustration, gesturing at Sarah like she was the problem instead of the situation itself. Denise turned on Sarah with a look that could have frozen water. "Sarah, why don't you head down to check on room 412? I'll take over here." It wasn't a request. Sarah felt the heat rise in her chest. Not embarrassment, but something closer to disbelief. She had done nothing wrong. She had followed protocol exactly. She had stayed calm under pressure that would have rattled plenty of experienced nurses. And in return, her own supervisor was throwing her under the bus in front of an angry, grieving stranger, simply to avoid conflict with a wealthy family whose name was bolted to the wall downstairs in bronze letters. "Of course," Sarah said, and walked away without another word, chart tucked under her arm, spine straight, giving nothing away. That was the moment the betrayal really landed, not in some dramatic, screaming confrontation, but in that small, quiet dismissal. In 11 days, Sarah had done everything asked of her. She'd taken every overflow shift, every difficult patient, every task nobody else wanted, without ever once complaining. And the first time she was actually treated unfairly by a patient's family, her supervisor sided against her instantly, without asking a single question about what had actually happened. Word travels fast in a hospital. By the time Sarah reached the break room 20 minutes later to grab 5 minutes of quiet before her next round, 2 other nurses were already whispering about the scene on the 4th floor. One of them, a younger nurse named Priya who had trained under Sarah's shadow shifts during her first week, gave Sarah a sympathetic look. "Denise really just left you out there like that? In front of everyone?" Sarah shrugged, filling a paper cup with lukewarm coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting since morning. "It's fine. He's scared for his dad. People say things when they're scared." "That's not the point," Priya said, lowering her voice. "You didn't do anything wrong. And Denise knows it. She just didn't want the Whitfield family filing a complaint that lands on her desk." Sarah didn't answer right away. She'd learned a long time ago that arguing about fairness rarely changed anything in the moment. What mattered wasn't whether people believed you immediately. It was whether you kept doing your job well regardless and let the truth surface on its own time. But something in her had shifted. Not anger, exactly. More like a quiet, settled resolve. The same feeling she used to get in the field right before things got difficult. The feeling that said, "Stay calm, stay ready. This isn't over yet." What Sarah didn't she had no idea was that the situation was about to get worse before it got better. And it wasn't going to come from Chase Whitfield directly. It was going to come from the hospital itself. 40 minutes after the hallway incident, a man named Gregory Pham, the hospital's vice president of patient relations, appeared on the 4th floor. Gregory's entire job existed to keep wealthy donors happy, and Arthur Whitfield wasn't just any donor. He sat on the hospital's board of directors and had personally funded the cardiac wing renovation 2 years earlier to the tune of $11 million. Gregory found Denise first. "I heard there was an incident with the Whitfield family," he said, his voice tight with the particular anxiety of a man whose entire career depended on rich people staying comfortable. "Tell me this is handled." "It's handled," Denise said quickly. "I pulled the nurse off the case." Good, that's good. Gregory exhaled. Which nurse? Sarah Reyes. She's new, she's only been here. I don't care how new she is, Gregory said. I want her to apologize to Mr. Whitfield's son directly, tonight, before this becomes something the family remembers when they're deciding where their next donation goes. When Denise found Sarah 20 minutes later near the supply closet on the 3rd floor, her tone had changed completely from the sympathy Priya had shown earlier. Gregory wants you to apologize to Chase Whitfield, Denise said, arms crossed. Personally, tonight. Sarah felt something harden in her chest, though her face stayed perfectly still. The same stillness that had once kept an entire fire team calm during a night when everything was falling apart around them. Apologize for what exactly? I didn't do anything except tell him his father's numbers looked good. It doesn't matter what you did. It matters what the hospital needs right now. Denise's voice had an edge of desperation in it now, the sound of someone passing pressure downward because she didn't have the spine to absorb it herself. You're new. This is how it works. You want to keep this job, you smooth this over. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. She thought about 6 years of learning that the loudest person in the room usually wasn't the strongest one. She thought about Diesel, about the 11 minutes she'd spent with her hands pressed against his leg while the world came apart around them, about how none of that, none of the actual hardest things she'd ever survived, had anything to do with whether some scared, wealthy young man's ego stayed intact. I'll apologize for the misunderstanding, Sarah said finally, choosing her words with the same precision she'd once used to talk a panicking teammate through a tourniquet application over a crackling radio. I won't apologize for doing my job correctly. There's a difference, and I think you know it. Sarah, he's talking about filing a complaint with the state board. Do you understand what that could mean for your license? For this early in your civilian career? I understand exactly what it could mean, Sarah said. I also understand that if I start apologizing for things I didn't do wrong, every difficult family that walks through those doors is going to learn that yelling gets results here. That's not good for me. It's not good for the next nurse he decides to yell at either. Denise opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Somewhere underneath 9 years of learning to prioritize donor comfort over almost everything else, there was still a nurse who remembered why she'd taken this job in the first place. And for just a moment, that nurse recognized something true in what Sarah had said. She didn't have the courage yet to act on it, but she heard it. Denise didn't have a response to that. She just walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the supply closet doorway, feeling the particular loneliness of being right and unsupported at the same time. It was a feeling Sarah recognized. It just usually Whitfield had stabilized enough that the doctors allowed a short visit from extended family. The hallway outside his room filled with people, cousins, business partners, a few hospital administrators who'd come to personally check on their most valuable donor, including Gregory Pham himself, hovering near the nurse's station with the anxious energy of a man watching a very expensive vase teeter on the edge of a shelf. Chase, meanwhile, had worked himself into a strange, restless energy. Fear that has nowhere to go tends to curdle into something else entirely. In Chase's case, fed by exhaustion and the unresolved sting of feeling dismissed by some new nurse, it curdled into bravado. He'd been telling anyone who'd listen about the incident earlier, how some nurse had disrespected his father's care, how the hospital clearly didn't take this seriously enough. A small crowd had gathered near the nurse's station, drawn by the tension the way people are always drawn to the possibility of a scene. That's when Sarah came back down the hall to check on another patient, exactly as she'd been scheduled to before any of this started. She hadn't sought Chase out. She hadn't avoided him either. She was simply doing her job, the way she'd told Denise she would, apology or no apology. Chase spotted her immediately. There she is, he said loudly, loud enough for the whole hallway to hear, loud enough that Gregory Pham visibly flinched near the nurse's station, the nurse who thinks she knows better than actual doctors. Sarah kept walking, chart in hand, refusing to engage, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be fishing for. But Chase stepped directly into her path. You know what? Forget it. I don't even want an apology anymore, he said, his voice carrying that particular edge of someone who has decided to turn humiliation into a performance for an audience. Since you're so confident, so calm, so sure of yourself, how about we settle this like adults, you and me, right now? A ripple of confused laughter moved through the small crowd. Somebody near the back said, "Is he serious?" He was serious. "I've got a black belt," Chase continued, squaring his shoulders, playing to the small audience that had formed. 3 years competing. State finals twice. I'll go easy on you, just to prove a point, that maybe you people should think twice before talking down to a family that's given this hospital millions of dollars. Grown man, a trained fighter, publicly challenging an exhausted ICU nurse to some kind of demonstration match in a hospital hallway. And yet nobody laughed for long because there was something genuinely unsettling about how serious he looked, how close he'd stepped, how his hands had curled slightly at his sides in a way that suggested muscle memory more than conscious threat. Denise, standing near the nurse's station, went pale and said nothing. Gregory Pham, standing beside her, opened his mouth as if to intervene and then visibly reconsidered, because stepping between an angry Whitfield and anyone else felt like a career risk he wasn't prepared to take. Nobody stepped in. Sarah stood there for a moment, chart still in hand, looking at Chase Whitfield with an expression that wasn't fear and wasn't even really anger. It was something closer to recognition. The look of someone taking quiet measure of a threat, the way she'd been trained to do 1,000 times before, in places far more dangerous than a hospital corridor. "You really want to do this here," she said quietly. Not a threat, just a question, giving him one last chance to back out with his dignity intact. "Scared?" Chase said, smirking now, feeding off the attention. That's when Sarah set the chart down on the counter and rolled up the sleeve of her scrub top. Inside of her forearm was a small, simple tattoo, an anchor wrapped with a trident, and beneath it, 3 sets of initials. The call signs and memory of men who had shaped the person she'd become, one of whom hadn't made it home. A few people near the front of the crowd went quiet immediately. One of the hospital security guards, an older man named Marcus, who'd done 2 tours in the Marine Corps before this job, straightened up like he'd been struck by lightning, his professional posture snapping into something sharper. "Is that—" Marcus started. "Yeah," Sarah said quietly, not looking away from Chase. "It is." Chase blinked, confused. To him, it was just a tattoo. He had no context for what it meant. No idea that a Navy Special Warfare trident on someone's arm, paired with a quiet memorial of initials, told an entire story to anyone who'd served or been close to someone who had. But Marcus knew, and within seconds, he'd moved from his post by the elevator to stand a few feet away, quiet but present, the way people who understand real danger instinctively position themselves. Not aggressive, just ready. "Sir," Marcus said carefully to Chase, "I don't think you understand who you're talking to." Chase let out a short, disbelieving laugh, though it came out thinner than he intended. "What, the tattoo? That's supposed to scare me?" "It's not about scaring you," Sarah said, her voice still level, still calm. The exact same calm she'd carried through the entire encounter. The same calm that had once kept wounded men alive while gunfire echoed around her. "I'm not going to fight you, Chase. Not because I can't. Because I don't need to." "That's convenient," Chase shot back, though something in his posture had already begun to shift. The swagger draining out of him in real time as the crowd's energy changed, as whispers rippled backward through the hallway. "You're scared for your dad," Sarah continued, her voice dropping just enough that it became almost private, even in the crowded hallway. "I get that. I've watched men die in front of me who I couldn't save no matter how hard I tried, and I know exactly what that fear does to a person. It makes you want to control something, anything, because you can't control the thing that actually matters. But picking a fight with me in this hallway isn't going to change what's happening in that room. It's not going to make your dad's heart any stronger." For the first time since Sarah had met him, Chase Whitfield had nothing to say. The silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer. 3 years, Sarah said quietly. I spent attached to a special operations medical unit overseas. I've held pressure on wounds while people were still shooting at us. I've done CPR in the back of a moving vehicle going 60 miles an hour down a road that wasn't paved. I've lost people I couldn't save, and I've carried that with me every single day since. I didn't come to this hospital to prove anything to anybody. I came here because I wanted to help people heal in a place where nobody's shooting at us. So no, I'm not going to fight you, but I am going to go check on your father, because that's my job, and I'm good at it. She picked her chart back up off the counter. Chase stood frozen, the anger completely drained out of him, replaced by something closer to shame. The particular shame of realizing in front of a crowd that you picked a fight with the wrong person for exactly the wrong reasons. Not Denise, not even Sarah, as she turned to walk away, was that 30 seconds later, everything in that hallway was about to become secondary to a much bigger emergency. Inside Arthur Whitfield's room, the monitor Sarah had checked less than an hour earlier began to shift. A subtle change at first, a small run of irregular beats that the machine registered before any human eye could have caught it, then a sharper, more violent arrhythmia that sent the monitor's alarm shrieking through the closed door and into the hallway. Sarah's head turned before the sound had even fully registered with anyone else. Years of training didn't ask permission. Her body was already moving. "That's him," she said, and didn't wait for confirmation. She pushed past Chase, past Marcus, past the stunned little crowd, and was through the door of Arthur Whitfield's room in under 4 seconds. Arthur was seizing lightly in the bed, his eyes rolled back, his color already draining to a gray that Sarah recognized immediately as dangerous. The monitor showed a rhythm that made her stomach drop even as her hands were already moving. Ventricular tachycardia, fast and unstable, the kind of rhythm that could deteriorate into full cardiac arrest within moments if it wasn't corrected. "I need the crash cart now," Sarah said, her voice suddenly transformed. Not louder, but sharper, cutting through the room with an authority that made every nurse who heard it move instantly. "Someone page Dr. Alvarez. Tell them it's VTAC. Tell them to hurry." Chase had followed her to the doorway, frozen, watching the woman he'd challenged to a fight 90 seconds earlier, now moving with a speed and precision that looked nothing like panic. She checked the pulse at his father's wrist, confirmed what the monitor was already screaming, and began positioning the defibrillator pads the moment the crash cart arrived, her hands moving with the exact same steadiness she'd shown in the hallway, except now that steadiness had a purpose that made the air feel electric. "Charging to 150, she said to the nurse beside her, a voice Priya recognized instantly from every code she'd ever watched go right. "Everyone clear." The shock rippled through Arthur Whitfield's body. The monitor held its breath for one agonizing second. Then it settled into a rhythm, steady, alive. For a moment after the shock, nothing happened. The monitor held a flat, uncertain line that felt to everyone in the room like it stretched on for minutes instead of the single second it actually took. Priya, standing at the foot of the bed with the code cart, glanced at Sarah's face for some sign of what to do next and found nothing there but steady focus. No panic, no hesitation, just quiet readiness to shock again if the rhythm didn't return. Then the line jumped, once, twice, and settled into something recognizably human, fast but steady, the kind of rhythm a heart falls into when it decides, against the odds, to keep going. "There it is," Sarah said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, the same 3 words she'd said once before, years earlier in a much louder room, watching a different monitor confirm that a different person was going to live. Only then did she allow herself a single, full breath. Dr. Alvarez arrived 40 seconds later to find the situation already stabilized, Sarah calmly relaying vitals and timeline with the crisp economy of someone who had done this exact thing, under far worse conditions, more times than she could easily count. "Good work," Dr. Alvarez said, glancing at her with something like surprise. "That could have gone very differently if you hadn't caught it that fast." "I was already close by," Sarah said simply, not mentioning why. In the doorway, Chase stood with his hand pressed against the frame, watching the woman who, 30 seconds earlier, he'd accused of not being competent enough to check his father's vitals, now standing at the center of the exact moment that had actually mattered. The moment that decided whether his father lived or didn't. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His face said everything his pride had refused to say. Once Arthur Whitfield had been stabilized and moved to a slightly more monitored bed, and once the hallway had returned to its normal, quiet hum, Chase found Sarah at the nurse's station, updating a chart under the dim overnight lighting. He stood there for a long moment before speaking, and when he finally did, his voice had none of the sharp edges from earlier. "You saved his life tonight," he said. "Twice, actually. Once by not fighting me when I was being an idiot, and I understand that now, and then again in there, when it actually mattered." Sarah didn't look up right away, finishing the line she was writing before setting the pen down. "I know. I did my job. That's the point I'm trying to make. Both times." Chase ran a hand through his hair, looking younger suddenly, less like the man who'd squared up in the hallway and more like a scared kid whose father had almost died twice in one day. "I'm sorry. For all of it. The way I talked to you earlier, the challenge, all of it. I was scared, and I took it out on the person who was actually trying to help. That's not an excuse. I know it's not." "It's not," Sarah agreed. Then, more gently, "But it's honest. That counts for something." "That tattoo," Chase said. "Can I ask what it means? All of it, not just the branch." Sarah looked down at her forearm for a moment, at the anchor and the trident and the 3 sets of initials that had been there for 3 years, quietly telling a story almost nobody ever asked to hear in full. "It means I don't take a single day for granted," she said. "It means some people didn't get to come home, and I did, and I owe it to them to actually live the life I got to keep. It's not something I show off. I showed it to you tonight because you needed to understand something, and words weren't getting through." Chase nodded slowly, absorbing that in a way that suggested it might actually stay with him. "For what it's worth, my dad wants to talk to you when he's up for visitors again." "I'll make sure I'm on his rotation," Sarah said, "assuming Denise doesn't reassign me again." At that, Denise, who had been hovering nearby pretending to organize a supply cart, straightened up. "You're not being reassigned," she said quietly. "I already spoke to Gregory, and I owe you an apology too, a real one, not the kind I asked you to give tonight." "I appreciate that," Sarah said, and meant it, though the words landed lighter than they might have a week earlier. Trust, once cracked, rebuilds slowly. But it does rebuild if the people around you are actually willing to move through St. Marian Medical Center the way stories always do in hospitals, fast and slightly exaggerated with each retelling. By the next morning, half the staff on the 4th floor had heard some version of the new nurse who used to be a Navy SEAL, who saved a billionaire's life during a code right after almost fighting his son in the hallway. A version that wasn't entirely accurate on several counts, but close enough in spirit that Sarah didn't bother correcting it every time it came up. What mattered more than the story spreading was what changed because of it. Denise stopped assigning Sarah every unwanted overflow shift out of habit and started actually asking her opinion during rounds. It wasn't dramatic. It was small, everyday respect, the kind that should have been there from day one, and finally was. A few weeks later, when a new hire started and Denise caught herself sliding into old habits, Sarah noticed her stop, reconsider, and hand the new nurse a fair rotation instead. Small changes, the kind that stick because they're chosen, not performed. Gregory Pham, for his part, never mentioned the apology he'd demanded again. Whether out of embarrassment or simple self-preservation, he made a quiet point afterward of treating Sarah with unusual deference whenever their paths crossed. Chase Whitfield came back to the hospital every day for the next 2 weeks while his father recovered fully from the surgery that followed his cardiac event. Each time, he made a point of stopping by the nurse's station, quieter now, more careful with his words, sometimes bringing coffee for the overnight staff without being asked. On the day Arthur was finally discharged, Chase found Sarah in the hallway one last time. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, "for how you handled that. You could have made me look like an idiot in front of everyone. You didn't. And then you saved his life an hour later like it was nothing. You did a good enough job of making yourself look foolish on your own," Sarah said, but there was warmth in it now, not sharpness. For what it's worth, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you were terrified, and terrified people don't always make good decisions. Chase actually laughed, a real laugh, not the performance from the hallway days earlier. Fair. For what it's worth, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about control, about my dad. He paused, glancing down at his father, seated in a wheelchair nearby, watching the exchange with quiet interest. I signed up to volunteer down at the VA hospital across town. Figured I could use a little humility, and maybe I could actually help somebody instead of yelling at them when I'm scared. Sarah smiled genuinely, for what might have been the first time since she'd started at St. Marian. That's a good place to start. Arthur Whitfield, still weak but alert, wheeled himself a few feet closer. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "I don't know how to properly thank someone for a second chance at life, but I'd like to try. The hospital board is establishing a scholarship fund for nursing students who've served in the military. I'd like your input on how it should work, if you're willing." Sarah paused, genuinely surprised. "I'd be honored, Mr. Whitfield." As Chase walked away beside his father, wheeling him toward the elevator, Sarah stood there for a moment in the quiet of the hallway, thinking about how strange it was. That the thing which finally made people at this hospital take her seriously wasn't a fight. It was the moment she refused to have one, followed by the moment she was needed most, and rose to whose story matters here. Someone easy to overlook in the middle of a billionaire's cardiac emergency and a hallway confrontation that nearly turned into a spectacle. Her name was Priya Desai, and she was 24 years old, 8 months into her very first nursing job, and quietly convinced she'd made a terrible mistake choosing this career. Priya had wanted to be a nurse since she was 12 years old, ever since a pediatric nurse named Ruth had held her hand through 3 rounds of chemotherapy and made a terrifying year feel, somehow, survivable. But the reality of the job, the 12-hour shifts, the difficult families, the way senior staff sometimes treated new hires like furniture, had worn her down faster than she'd expected. She'd started keeping a mental list, growing longer every week, of reasons to quit and go back to school for something quieter. The night Sarah stood in that hallway and refused to fight Chase Whitfield, Priya had been 3 feet away, holding a stack of charts, absolutely certain she was about to watch someone get hurt and equally certain that nobody, including her, was going to do anything about it. What she watched instead rearranged something in her. She watched a woman half the size of her opponent stand completely still, completely calm, and simply refuse to be baited into the reaction everyone expected. She watched Marcus step forward the second he recognized what was actually happening, quietly, without drama. And 90 seconds later, she watched that same calm woman transform into someone else entirely, sharp, fast, utterly certain. The moment an actual emergency began, saving a man's life with the kind of competence Priya had always hoped she'd have someday and secretly feared she never would. After the code ended, after Dr. Alvarez left, after the hallway slowly emptied back into its normal, quiet hum, Priya found Sarah restocking a supply cart and stood there for a moment, unsure how to say what she wanted to say. "Can I ask you something?" Priya finally said. "Of course. How did you know? In the hallway, I mean. How did you know not to react?" Sarah considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "I didn't decide not to react in that moment. I decided that a long time ago, in a different life, in situations a lot scarier than an angry guy in a hospital hallway. By the time you get to a moment like that, the decision's already made. You just have to trust it." "I don't think I have that yet," Priya admitted quietly. "I keep thinking I'm not cut out for this. Every hard shift, I go home and wonder if I made the wrong choice." Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at her directly, the way she might have once looked at a nervous new corpsman on their first deployment, someone who needed honesty more than reassurance. "You know what the difference is between someone who's not cut out for this and someone who's still learning?" Sarah asked. "The person who's not cut out for it stops showing up. You're still here, 8 months in, after plenty of shifts that probably made you want to quit. That's not weakness, Priya. That's exactly what this job actually requires. Nobody's calm on their first hard night. You get calm by having hard nights and coming back anyway. Priya turned that over for a long moment. It doesn't feel like that most days. It won't, not for a while. But 6 years from now, some new nurse is going to be standing where you're standing right now, telling you she doesn't think she's cut out for this. And you're going to know exactly what to say, because you'll have actually lived it. Priya didn't quit. She stayed at St. Marian for the next 4 years, slowly becoming the kind of steady, reliable presence on the floor that younger nurses gravitated toward during hard shifts. When Sarah's veteran scholarship program launched, Priya was the first person to volunteer as a peer mentor for incoming recipients, quietly passing forward a version of the same conversation that had kept her in the profession on a night she'd merely walked away from exactly where the advice originally came from. She didn't need to. That's how the good lessons travel. Quietly, hand to hand, long after the person who first said them has moved on to teach someone else Chase Whitfield, and honestly, about most of us at our worst moments. Fear rarely announces itself honestly. It shows up dressed as anger, as arrogance, as the need to prove something to a room full of strangers. And the loudest person in a room is very rarely the strongest one in it. Sarah Reyes didn't need to throw a punch to win that hallway. She'd already survived things far harder than a spoiled young man's temper. Real strength, the kind she'd learned the hard way in places she still didn't talk about, wasn't about proving you could win a fight. It was about knowing you didn't have to, and about having something better to give when it actually mattered, which came less than an hour later, in a very different kind of emergency. There's a lesson in that for all of us. The people who've truly been through the fire rarely need to tell you about it. They don't need to raise their voice or throw their weight around or remind you of what they've survived. They just show up quietly capable, ready for whatever the day throws at them. And when the moment finally comes to reveal who they really are, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. Chase Whitfield learned that lesson in a hospital hallway in front of 30 strangers in the worst possible way, and then watched the proof of it play out in the most important way possible, less than an hour later. But he learned it. And in the weeks that followed, by all accounts, he became a genuinely better version of himself because of it. Not because he was shamed into it, but because he was shown, clearly and undeniably, what real strength actually looks like. As for Sarah, she kept working at St. Marian, kept being underestimated by new patients and new staff who didn't know her story, and kept quietly proving day after day that the calmest person in the room is often the one you should least want to underestimate, because sometimes the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who never need to tell you how strong they are. They just show you, once when it counts most. Arthur Whitfield walked out of St. Marian Medical Center on his own 2 feet. Sarah Reyes found herself sitting in a conference room on the hospital's top floor, a room she'd never had reason to enter before, with a view of the city skyline she'd only ever seen from photographs in the lobby. Around the table sat 3 members of the hospital board, a representative from the nursing school across town, and Arthur Whitfield himself, looking stronger than he had in weeks, color back in his face, a folder of paperwork in front of him labeled the Bishop Diesel Memorial Nursing Scholarship. Sarah had nearly dropped her coffee the first time she'd seen the name on the paperwork. "I hope it's all right," Arthur said, watching her reaction carefully. "Chase mentioned the names meant something to you. We wanted the fund to carry them forward, if that's something you're comfortable with." For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. 6 years of carrying 2 names quietly on her own arm, and now they were about to be printed on scholarship letters handed to nursing students who would never know the men behind them, who would simply benefit from what those men's memory had built. "It's more than all right," she finally said. "It's exactly right." The fund, as they'd designed it, would cover full tuition for veterans transitioning into nursing programs. People like Sarah had been 3 years earlier, sitting in a community college parking lot with a folder of GI Bill paperwork and no idea if any of it would actually add up to a new life. 12 scholarships a year, renewable, with priority given to combat medics and corpsmen making the same transition she'd made. "There's one more thing," Arthur said, sliding a second folder across the table. "The board would like to offer you a position helping oversee the program, part clinical, part mentorship, working directly with recipients as they come through the hospital system. It wouldn't replace your floor work unless you wanted it to, but we think you'd be good at helping people navigate that transition. Better than good, honestly." Sarah looked at the folder for a long moment, thinking about 11 days of being handed the overflow charts, of Denise's clipped instructions, of a version of herself 6 weeks ago who hadn't yet been seen for who she really was. "I'd like that," she said, "on one condition. Name it." "Chase gets to sit in on the first cohort's welcome orientation. He's been volunteering at the VA for 6 weeks now. I think hearing from someone who's still figuring out how to be better in real time might land with new veterans more than hearing from someone who's already got it all worked out." Arthur smiled. The first real smile Sarah had seen from him. Sarah didn't become a different person overnight. 9 years of habits don't dissolve in 6 weeks. But something had genuinely shifted in her since the night of the code, something she found herself thinking about at odd moments. Driving home, standing in the shower, lying awake at 2 a.m, turning it over like a stone in her pocket. She'd built her entire approach to management on a simple, unspoken rule: keep the important people happy and everything else sorts itself out. It had worked in the narrow sense that her floor ran smoothly and complaints rarely made it to her supervisors. But watching Sarah stand calmly in that hallway, refusing to fight, and then watching her move through that code with a precision Denise herself, 9 years in, wasn't sure she could have matched. It had cracked something open. She started asking Sarah questions, actual questions, about her training, about how she'd learned to stay that calm under that kind of pressure. Sarah, for her part, answered honestly but without ceremony, the way she answered most things. "You just don't let the noise make the decision for you," Sarah told her one slow Tuesday night, echoing words that weren't originally hers but had become permanently woven into how she thought. "Panic is loud. It wants you to react to it instead of the actual problem. You have to be quieter than the panic." Denise turned that phrase over for a long time. Eventually, she started using a version of it herself, with newer nurses, in moments when she caught them freezing up during a difficult call. It wasn't Sarah's phrase anymore by then. It had become Denise's, passed forward the way good lessons usually are, quietly, without credit, simply because they were true and worth repeating. 3 months later, when a new nurse started on the floor, nervous, overqualified for the grunt work she was initially handed, quiet in the way people are when they're still sizing up a new environment, Denise made a point of pulling her aside on the first day. "I want you to know something," Denise said. "Around here, we don't judge people by how loud they are. Some of the best nurses I've ever worked with barely say a word until it matters. Just do good work. That's what actually gets noticed here, eventually, even if it doesn't feel like it some days." She didn't say Sarah's name. She didn't need to. The lesson had already become part of Chase Whitfield, and honestly, about most of us at our worst moments. Fear rarely announces itself honestly. It shows up dressed as anger, as arrogance, as the need to prove something to a room full of strangers. And the loudest person in a room is very rarely the strongest one in it. Sarah Reyes didn't need to throw a punch to win that hallway. She'd already survived things far harder than a spoiled young man's temper. Real strength wasn't about proving she could win a fight. It was about knowing she didn't have to. And about having something better to give when it actually mattered less than an hour later, in a very different kind of emergency. But this story was never really just about Sarah or Chase or even Arthur. It was about everyone standing in that hallway who had a choice to make and didn't know it yet. Denise, choosing convenience over fairness, and later choosing to actually learn from it. Gregory choosing donor comfort over doing what was right and quietly recalibrating afterward. Marcus, the security guard, choosing to step forward the moment he recognized what was actually happening, when nobody else would. Every single one of them was tested that day in small ways that had nothing to do with fists. and most of them eventually chose better, not because they were forced to, but because they were shown, clearly and undeniably, what better actually looked like. That's the real lesson here. Strength that has nothing left to prove doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need to raise its voice or throw its weight around or remind anyone of what it survived. It just shows up, quietly capable, ready for whatever the day throws at it. And when the moment finally comes to reveal itself, it speaks louder than any argument ever could. And it changes the people who witness it, long after the moment itself has passed. Sarah Reyes kept working at St. Marian, kept mentoring the veterans who came through her scholarship program, one nervous conversation at a time, kept being underestimated occasionally by people who didn't yet know her story, and kept quietly proving, day after day, that the calmest person in the room is often the one you should least want to underestimate. Because sometimes, the strongest people you'll ever meet are the ones who never need to tell you how strong they are. They just show you, once, when it counts most, and you never forget it.